Let's go on to the other Epstein now. So that guy was Professor Robert Epstein at the Senate Judiciary Committee last month. But the other Epstein, Martin, much more serious. And let's start this week with something which came out last weekend, which is this interview with Virginia Roberts Guiffre, or Guiffre. She was a girl of, I believe, 17 years old when she was photographed alongside Prince Andrew, the famous picture. She was an Epstein runaway. And I'll put the full version of this on our podcast because there's some quite dodgy details in there. So this is Virginia talking about her experience living with Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
It kind of worked like a pyramid scheme. Ghislaine brought me in. I brought other girls in. Those girls brought other girls in. And no matter what, Geoffrey constantly had that open revolving door of young women, young teenagers, children, I like to call them, coming through his door for one purpose and one purpose alone. And he didn't care what he had to do to get that reaction from them, to get them to have sex with him or get them to... I mean, sometimes he would just jerk off in front of them and rub his nipples. Sometimes he would have intercourse with them. Sometimes he'd make them, give them blowjobs. Ghislaine participated in these acts with him as well, and that was just the never-ending cycle. That was every single day. So we were at the island by ourselves, Geoffrey and me and Ghislaine. And we had gone for a nice snorkeling event. I mean, in some ways, we were a little fucked up family. I mean, we would sit together and watch Sex and the City together, and we would go hiking. We would make things together. I mean, we collected all this pirate treasure, like just broken glass bottles, and we make a table from it. Like, we did weird family stuff. All right, so it just wasn't all about that, but that was how this worked, the inner goings of it. It was, all right, you need to have sex at least, Geoffrey needs to have sex at least 7 times a day and have this happen at least, this many times a day. But in the meantime, we're going to sit back and have some popcorn while you're giving him a blowjob and watching Sex in the City. Like, it was just really screwed up, kind of a little family unit for a while. So anyways, one day we went snorkeling on Jeffrey's Island, and it was beautiful. It was a great day. I was exhausted. It was, hard to swim in the water. And we get up and we're taking off our flippers on the jetty. And Ghislaine, starts talking to me about how would I feel about having a child. What? Having a baby? Yeah, it would be your baby, but it would really be our baby. And we would have you sign a document that says that you would have an allowance. We would pay you $200,000 a month, and you would have a nice house. But this child is really ours, and we can do what we want to do with our child. You could basically never take this child from us. I said, okay. Let me, get my massage certificate, and I really want that. That's important to me, because eventually when you guys are done with me, I would like to have something to do with my life. Okay, we'll work on that, and blah, blah, blah. So a few months later, he sent me to Thailand to go get a massage certificate, right, on top of picking up another girl for him, of course. I escaped. I called Geoffrey to let him know that I was not coming back and I was not bringing the little Thai girl back, and he said, you know what, have a nice life, and hung up the phone.
Well, shocking stuff, isn't it? I mean, we're getting more and more information about how this operation worked. It doesn't shock me or surprise me. As I said earlier in the first hour, this is all related to blackmail of important people. It's not just, depraved behaviour for the sake of it.
But that doesn't actually square with what she's saying there about them wanting Virginia to have children for them and to sign a certificate saying that you will look after these children, we will pay you $200,000 a month to look after them, but they won't be your children, they'll be ours, and we can do what we want.
Well, in other words, as they grow up, they will be inculcated into the slave reality of the cult in which they've been born. That's what that implies, isn't it?
So, I mean, in a way, one does wonder if Virginia herself might have been in danger by speaking out about this.
Well, I'm quite sure lots of people who've spoken out about these things have ended up dead. It's quite clear. I mean, as I say, this is not just to do with wealthy people having bad attitudes towards children and women. The whole purpose of this is what intelligence services have been using for years as a means of blackmailing powerful people.
But there's wheels within wheels, aren't there? So that you reckon that's at the core. But there are other things which are also used as cover stories. Anyway, let's have a listen now to someone you mentioned last week. It's Whitney Webb, Martin. And here she is talking about some of the, I suppose, deeper Epstein network and looking into the UK. And also something called the Promis Software scandal. Do you know anything about that? The Promis Software scandal. Apparently Epstein was deeply involved in all that and many people who were connected with him.
Well, Promis was, I think it was developed by the CIA as a means of trying to predict terrorist attacks, because they said, well, if people start moving money around, like the put options on 9/11 on the airlines, then that's an indication that there's going to be a terrorist attack. And I believe that's why, and I think there was some general talking about we should employ people to look into this as a means of predicting terrorism. But of course, it did predict a terrorist attack. There were put options on the airlines, but the put options ultimately led back to Buzzy Krongard, who was deputy director of the CIA. So predicting terrorism is quite easy if you're the ones who are doing it.
Promis, apparently, you can look it up under the INSLAW INSLAW scandal, a Washington DC based information technology company that marketed case management software for corporate and government user, developed Promis, an early case management software. So yes, I guess you're right. There's an article, Octopus and the Promis Software scandal. So the idea is they're trying to predict, or somehow predict, when people are going to do terrorist attacks before they actually do them. Is this real? Is it able,
that's only one level. In actual fact, what they want is to get a load of money so that they can then use it, and there is dirty scams.
But can we turn this on its head? Is it possible for us sitting in a studio here to predict what the global elite might do as a possible terrorist attack?
Well, there are obviously clues in the way stock markets operate about what goes on. I mentioned the put options on the airlines on 9/11. Clearly, somebody had inside knowledge, and somebody made a load of money. But when it was looked into by, I've forgotten the name of the guy now, the former FBI investigator.
John O'Neill?
No, not John O'Neill. Mike
Rupert?
That it led back to inside the US security structure. Now, if you are CIA, Mossad, and you are going to carry out a 9/11, then you can use it as a means of making money because you take a put option on.
What I'm getting to with this Promis software here is that you can sell a form of software which will predict something that you yourself are going to do, and then you'll say, "Oh, look, we predicted it."
Exactly. So, in other words, the idea that they want to use the stock market to try and predict terrorist attacks is a blind. In actual fact, they're the ones doing the terrorist attacks, so it's just another way for them to make money, just as the people who own the Twin Towers insured them against terrorist attack just as they bought them 6 weeks earlier and then made a fortune. Larry Silverstein got 14 million, or was it billion dollars in insurance payout.
Anyway, fascinating that the Epstein scandal goes right into all of this stuff. Also, Martin, you mentioned people who have been suicided or had mysterious deaths connected, and Whitney Webb talks about that too now.
I talked about the OSS. It's believed that Donald Barr originally hired Jeffrey Epstein to work in the Dalton School, and Donald Barr had previously worked at the OSS. After that, he was hired to work at Bear Stearns. Alan Greenberg was a close friend of Roy Cohn, and I was the honorary chairman of a dinner for him that was honoring Roy Cohn, I believe, in 1983. And the other honorary chairmen were other close friends of Roy Cohn, including Rupert Murdoch and Donald Trump. After he left Bear Stearns in 1981, he, according to journalist Vicky Ward, was a financial bounty hunter of sorts, looking to chase down money for governments and powerful people. The Evening Standard of England later reported that during that time, Epstein claimed that he was working for the CIA. Vicky Ward later said that one of his clients during that time was Adnan Khashoggi, who was known to be working for the Mossad. He was also working for the CIA, and he was a major player in this Iran-Contra scandal. Then in 1987, he meets up with Leslie Wexner, who has connections to this Meyer-Lansky crime syndicate, as I point out in part 3. He also meets up with Steve Hoffenberg, who he allegedly met through John Mitchell, who is the former attorney general to Richard Nixon. And Mitchell was actually cited as a friend by Craig Spence, a disgraced Washington lobbyist who was also running a sexual blackmail operation with children that was discovered in the late 80s. And Craig Spence, and some similarity to Jeffrey Epstein, was found dead under somewhat mysterious circumstances, and his death was ruled a suicide. And that takes us up to 1991, which right after that, that's the same year that Robert Maxwell died, as well as several other people that were connected to the Promis Software scandal, not just Maxwell. That includes Senator Towers, also died that year, as did journalist Danny Casolaro, who was investigating that scandal. And soon after Robert Maxwell died, his daughter, Ghislaine Maxwell, moved to New York and began her relationship with Jeffrey Epstein. And as I point out in part 3 of my series, Robert Maxwell was known to be an operative for the Mossad and did several favors for Israel over the course of his career, and was also using the Daily Mirror group, some of the funding for that to fund Mossad operations in Europe. So the intelligence links, I think, are very clear, and that's just the early history. We're not even getting in to the 90s yet, and I'm going to be delving more into those connections in part 4 of my series, which I hope to be out in a few days.
That's Whitney Webb there, and she's a writer for Mint Press News. She's based down in Chile. Her latest article, as she talks about there, Martin, is out now. It's called From Spook Air to the Lolita Express, the genesis and evolution of the Jeffrey Epstein-Bill Clinton relationship. So this is, I suppose, why so many people are focusing on Epstein, and I'm not going to let this go away, is because he was very, very close to so many powerful people. And she mentions just a few there. She's talking about, in just a few minutes, going through several decades, the links to Iran-Contra, this guy, Leslie Wexner, who's the financier of these high street sex shops like Victoria's Secret, things like that, and also to this guy Meyer Lansky, you've mentioned on this show quite a few times, Martin.
Yeah, well, I mean, the linkages between the mob, Meyer Lansky, the intelligence services, OSS, CIA, in the US, and Mossad are these organisations have been working together for years and years and years on things like bringing drugs into the US to fund Iran, to fund the Contras in Nicaragua, which killed 30,000 civilians. These people are gangsters, and the Israeli state is a gangster
what she's
state,
describing there, what she's describing there, is really the highest level people involved in things like drug smuggling, political machinations, trying to get massive government contracts to con people out of vast sums of money, and also these high level links to the mob. Now, anyone that's listened to this show over the years will know that we have identified pretty certainly the various people involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy back in 1963, the US president, down to the David Atlee Phillips, CIA officer, and he was the commander of the operation, and his people working for him were Chicago mobsters, weren't they? They were hitmen for the Chicago mob, a guy called James Files, Johnny Roselli, and Charles Nicoletti. And James Files is still alive. The only reason he's still alive is because most of the others have died or whatever, but or been killed. But he was trained by the 82nd Airborne Division, and when there were attempts to assassinate James Files, he shot back, and he made sure that he wasn't going to be assassinated. He ended up in jail. Some fascinating stuff with James Files afterwards. But this is the mob effectively being involved with the CIA, killing the president, and then taking over the country, Martin. Absolutely.
And this is the real world, folks. And it's not about sovereignty and the things that people think it's about. This is the real world. This is how it really works.
Also involved in a lot of this is Ghislaine Maxwell. We heard particularly Virginia Roberts talking about her there, but obviously it was surprising that she hasn't been arrested and charged with child sex trafficking. She was quite clearly involved very, very heavily in what Epstein was up to. The Maxwell, she's the daughter of Robert Maxwell. And let's have a listen now to the former British MP George Galloway, because he was very, very much involved back in the 1980s with the whole scandal around the disappearance, one could say, or death of Robert Maxwell. Before we hear from Galloway, Martin, what do you make of what happened to Maxwell? I think he fell off the back of a ship, didn't he, and disappeared?
Well, obviously the conspiracy theory, if you like, is that he didn't just fall off the ship, that he was pushed because he knew too much and he needed to be got rid of.
So was he killed and given a new
life?
The
suspicion is that he was killed, yeah.
And given a new life or not?
Well, maybe given a new life or maybe not, but the point is the story doesn't add up.
The thing is, the similar to the Epstein thing, isn't it? Suddenly someone very, very, very powerful, involved with these intelligence services, etc., suddenly disappears.
Well, dead men tell no tales.
Okay, well, let's let George Galloway tell his side of the story. By the way, he's been taken off FM. He was on Talk Radio, I believe, or LBC, one of these radio channels in London, based in London, but he's now got his own, I think it's internet only, but anyhow, that is called The Mother of All Talk Shows, and here he is speaking on the most recent one about his knowledge and connection with the whole Robert Maxwell disappearance story.
In the 1980s, I was working for the satirical magazine in London called Private Eye. Robert Maxwell may well have been our public enemy number one. We regarded him as a fat fraud, fraudulent, a forgery, his whole life a forgery. And we were not afraid to say so. In one celebrated legal action taken by Maxwell against our magazine, our founder and editor, Richard Ingrams, went to prison rather than name me as the source of the story complained of. I never forgave Maxwell for that or for many other things. Late one Saturday night, the celebrated American author Seymour Hersh, the man who brought us the massacre of My Lai, the story behind the massacre of American war crimes in Vietnam, caused to be delivered to my London address a file of papers. It was a chapter in a book that he intended to publish, but in a very unusual move, Robert Maxwell's lawyers had forbidden to be printed, distributed, or sold a pre-publication injunction, which meant that it was impossible for this celebrated American author to have his story read here in Britain. But the papers were interesting enough to me that on the Monday I went into Parliament and concisely summarised the principal charges against Robert Maxwell from Seymour Hersh's book. They were, inter alia, that Maxwell was a Mossad agent, that Maxwell was the greatest thief in Britain in the 20th century and had stolen £500 million of his own employees' pension funds, that Maxwell had betrayed the whereabouts in London of the brave Israeli Jewish whistleblower Mordechai Vanunu, who came to London and foolishly turned up at Robert Maxwell's newspapers with the secrets of Israel's hundreds of nuclear weapons maintained at Dimona in the Negev desert. This story was subsequently published courageously by Andrew Neil at the Sunday Times, again of which more later. But his whereabouts, now known to Maxwell, were leaked, according to my motion in the British Parliament, to the Mossad, who honey-trapped Vanunu with a blonde woman in Leicester Square called Cindy, and he woke up drugged, gagged, and bound in the hold of an aircraft bound for Israel. When he got off that aircraft, his jaws were wired together like Hannibal Lecter, so that he couldn't impart any more truths to the world about Israel's illegal and secret nuclear arsenal.
Well, interesting there, Martin, that the courts, I mean, there's lots and lots to talk about there, but that the courts found against Richard Ingram's and Private Eye, and actually what they were doing was just refusing to name their source. And actually, it certainly looks now as if what George Galloway was saying about Maxwell was true.
Well, yes.
So if you print something that's true, you can still go to jail for it if you're a publisher, a printer, or maybe a broadcaster.
Well, look at Julian Assange, who's rotting in Belmarsh prison as we speak for exposing the criminality of the US government and the British government.
No, but the great tradition of Julian Assange still carries on, Martin. There's very, very brave people out there like Bellingcat doing his job.
Well, Bellingcat, as we all know, is basically a front for the NATO intelligence services. He's got no intelligence background whatsoever. They've picked him up as some kind of amateur sleuth who's an expert on everything, and they just feed him the line and he comes out with it.
So what do you make of Ghislaine Maxwell and her role in all of this? Clearly she's been procuring young girls. Why hasn't she been arrested? Why isn't she being charged like he was for child sex trafficking?
Well, you can imagine that these people have been running this stuff for years and they've got loads and loads of dirt on everybody involved. And that makes it very difficult to move against them because the people who have got the dirt on them don't want it to come out. And so, this is how they protect themselves.
Well, I'll have a little bit of an answer as well for that question in our next clip from the interview, which is going out on Dialect on Tuesday, the full interview. And this is with David Livingstone. He's the author of Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. He's based in Canada. And here he explains, amongst other things, that when Epstein got told that he wasn't going to be prosecuted a few years ago, he got basically slapped wrists, and the guy that led him off, who was a senior politician, I think he's now a Labour secretary, and he resigned when Epstein was arrested this most recent time. He was saying he was just told, well, Epstein is hands off. The justice system can do nothing to somebody like that. So it does rather go back to what we were saying originally about the royal family, is that there is an elite, and they really are above the law. That's certainly the case for Epstein in the States, as we're about to hear. But, Martin, this is a rather serious situation, isn't it? We're told that everyone's equal under the law, but actually the law is only for the poor people and those without the power to say, well, actually, I've got to get out of jail free card. This is something from the Monopoly game, which is quite real, it seems.
Well, the only thing I'd say about that is the big weakness of this criminal elite is that they are actually criminals. And that means that we're not talking about voting them out, we're talking about sending them to prison for crimes. And ultimately that's what will have to happen. It's what Imposimato was trying to do in Italy. It was the head of the Supreme Court there. And ultimately, there is going to be a rule of law, and that's what the demands are going to be.
So we're talking about get-out-of-jail-free cards here, but actually, in Epstein's case, he played his get-out-of-jail-free card, and the next time that his collar was felt, he didn't have any get-out-of-jail cards left.
Well, that's right, and of course, because of the information revolution we were talking about earlier in the hour, it's very difficult. Things that they've got away with for years suddenly come back to bite them in the bum years later. Is that potentially
a political shift under Trump? Do you think, or is
it? No, I think what it is that the knowledge of things like the JFK assassination, anybody who doubts that it was carried out from inside the state just needs to look at the voluminous evidence which they can access on their phone. In the past, when you argued with people about stuff like this, you'd have all the information, but they didn't have the information. Very hard to get people to read all the information, and therefore very difficult to catch the people who are doing it.
I mean, it's
all there for those who've got the time and the inclination. You can find out anything you want.
Before we hear from David Livingstone, the ultimate question, really, Martin, is why now with the Epstein arrest and suicide?
Well, why now is a very good question. I think it's to do with the fact that we're probably moving towards a financial collapse and a war, and various things, various loose ends are being tidied up.
So what you seem to be implying is that some people within the state, within the system, know this is happening, and they're trying to expose people who are involved.
Well, there may be. I'd like to think that some people involved within the police, intelligence services, and military are aware of the things that we're aware of, and they're trying to do something to deal with it. I often ask the question, what would you do if you were an honest cop in Nazi Germany? And it's a very difficult question to answer.
Anyway,
what should you do?
Let's now hear from the Canadian author David Livingstone, where he talks here about this whole transhumanism. What is this belief that Epstein had and many of the people surrounding him about the master race, about eugenics, and the main three parts of transhumanism he talks about here, which are pseudoscience, finance, and nihilism.
It's just a new name for the same old thing. It's because it's the same old thing that has been adapted to modern science, which is why it now has a new name. It's the same old interest that's modified in ways that it couldn't have before because of what's available through modern science. I think it's important to look at Epstein in context as well, too. It seems pretty evident to me that he was probably a spy working for the Mossad and the blackmail operation for Mossad. He's admitted himself that he worked for intelligence. And what's his name, Acosta, the judge that gave him his walkaway deal, he said himself recently that he wasn't able to touch Epstein because he was told that he was hands off because he was apparently an intelligence asset. So you look at the bigger picture and you look at, his connections are so deep, it's almost mind-boggling. The people in this black book included John Kerry, Kissinger, Steve Forbes, Richard Branson, celebrities like Dustin Hoffman, Ralph Fiennes, Katie Couric, George Papadopoulos, Stephanopoulos, sorry. And the list goes on and on and on and on. So many deep connections. So you got to wonder what kind of world is he operating in. So that world basically also boarded into a number of scientists. So people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, Marvin Minsky. These are all the people who, many of them were invited to his island for various discussions. So if you look at the pattern of Epstein's life, there's really three paths there that are parallel, and I think it's very much indicative of the sort of culture that these guys come from. So, first you can start with physics. So his first interest was in physics. Secondly, he ended up in finance, and then thirdly, his extracurricular activities. When I say sexual activities, so I feel those are not to be interpreted as being independent. They're all part of some kind. We can only speculate of what he's really coming from, but understanding the occult as an outside person, from what I've seen from my investigation, those are three paths that are commonly associated. So, the physics is basically often verges into an area of pseudoscience, as like alchemy has always been, and magic is basically always been a kind of pseudoscience. And then, finance, of course, is a way for them to maintain, achieve wealth, sustain a degree of authority and power. And then ultimately, they're often Luciferians or they are nihilists, and that nihilism or Gnosticism is expressed in a kind of libertinism, which regards, like Freud said, basically that sex is our basic drive and instinct.
So that's David Livingstone, the author of Transhumanism, The History of a Dangerous Idea. But Martin, he's really saying there that there's a lot of beliefs that elite people have, amongst which is obviously trying to gain more and more power, and techniques they have for that, which they do everything they can to keep as hidden as possible. Epstein wasn't really doing that.
Well, some of it's hidden, some of it's hidden in plain sight. Loads of billionaires and top people are big fans of Ayn Rand, the novelist, who basically just preached what she called objectivism, which was essentially personal selfishness, that people should just be personally selfish, and that being wealthy and powerful was good, and that nobody should try and help anybody else because that was a bad idea, and that caused them all the problems in the world.
Well, he talks
There's an astonishing amount of wealthy people who actually believe that is a philosophy. He's got no real basis with the real history of philosophy. It's just made up.
Is it
it's
social?
Very, very convenient for those who've got power.
Nowadays, is social Darwinism.
Well, social Darwinism was invented by Herbert Spencer in the 19th century, and of course social Darwinism was actually imposing upon Darwin's scientific theory a load of social ideas, as if the survival of the fittest implies that it's great that there should be some wealthy people and lots of poor people. Nothing in the actual theory of evolution says any such thing. It was an imposition of an ideology of supremacy.
Could it explain why we're seeing a shift away from public spending and caring for people and looking after those, for example, disabled people? I mean, this actually does line up to a certain extent.
The idea that
Martin, this does line up to a certain extent with all the Nazi ideas about basically killing off disabled people at birth.
Well, I mean, what was it? Gordon Gekko said, "Greed is good." Powerful people want to have their power, they want to have their money, and they are prepared to sacrifice the generality, and especially the weak and the powerless, to their goals. 'Twas ever thus. If you read the history of the Roman Empire, you'll see exactly that. If you read the history of the British Empire, you'll see that. If you look at the way we're living now, it's exactly the same thing.
I mean, do you seriously draw parallels between the elite and people surrounding Epstein and the Roman Empire?
Well, can't you see it? It looks very similar to the sort of things that used to go on in the Emperor's Court, and it's all in Suetonius. Human nature doesn't change that much. Powerful people are psychopathic. That's pretty clear. If you read your history books, that's pretty clear.
Well, I imagine there are actually different sort of opinions amongst powerful people, and those who are going to prevail are likely to be the most psychopathic ones, potentially.
Well, that's why psychopathy remains in the gene pool.
If there is no more rule of law, and which goes back to what we were saying earlier. Anyway, where do you think why do you think it's just final round off? Why do you think Ghislaine Maxwell hasn't been arrested, since she clearly was involved in child sex trafficking?
Well, I understand she's been seen in public reading a book about the CIA agents.
Well, there are some doubts over this photo as to how recent it is, and it also looks as if there may be some subliminal messages deliberately put out in that photograph.
Yes, indeed. So, in other words, the psychological warfare people are playing games. Ghislaine Maxwell is probably a Mossad agent, and therefore she's being protected, just like the 5 dancing Israelis on 9/11 who photographed the first plane crashing into the building, were subsequently arrested and then released, even though they clearly had foreknowledge of the attack. Ghislaine is being protected.